necessarily mean that you have Jesus in your heart.
Get right, get inside, get hungry, got appetite. Everlasting water, never get thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey.
You are listening to Chad Schafer on Disputed Lands.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. To those of you who've been watching the marathon, to those of you who have just joined us, welcome. This marathon series, as I have been saying at the beginning of every one of these hours of these series of shows, is the whole purpose for this marathon. It has a focus of doing one thing, and that is to raise money for Josh and Christina Peck with their sons, who was diagnosed almost exactly a year ago with leukemia. As many of you know, who have been impacted by cancer directly in your family, and there's not really any family today that hasn't been impacted in one form or another that's faced cancer, usually with parents or grandparents. But to have a child and a young child to be diagnosed, it's such a scary thing. And with Josh and Christina as my friends, and many of you, they've done so much for all of us in bringing us content and encouraging us and providing information. It's only right that we should do one of the most basic and forthright commands, and that's that we should show our love for one another. And what better way to do that to cross all theological boundaries that some of us have than to show our love by raising money. So what you will want to do is you will want to go to that website that's scrolling across the bottom of your screen right now. That's dailyrenegade.com. You don't want to click off of the show. Perhaps open a new tab, or if you got a second screen, put it on the second screen and go to the donate button. You can give $1, you can give $5, you can give $100, or if you're blessed enough that you could give more, please do give more. We have not set a target or a goal in amount of funds that we're seeking to raise here, because if I did that, you guys would meet it and stop giving. So we're going to hope and pray that you guys are going to be blessed enough and bless them enough to give what your heart desires, and we will exceed all expectations. In the description below, you will find not only my guest information for this hour's interview, but you will also find a GoFundMe link. Some of you may want to do it that way, should you want to remain anonymous. Just remember that if you do go through the GoFundMe, that GoFundMe takes a percentage. So whatever you may give through GoFundMe, they get a cut, and not all of it goes to Josh and Christina. If you want all of it to go Josh and Christina, go to the Daily Renegade website address that's scrolling across your screen right now. So without further ado, we're going to introduce to you a first-time guest on Disputed Lands on Take on the World TV. His name is Brian Godawa. Brian should be probably familiar with most of the people who have listened to my show, but I'm going to be pretty sure that there's going to be some of you who don't know who he is. So I'm going to read his bio, and then we're going to let Brian have a say here. So Brian, in case you didn't know, is an award-winning Hollywood screenwriter. To End All Wars is that production. A controversial movie blogger. He's also a controversial movie maker, blogger. I'm going to have his website on the screen in a moment. You can find it in below. He's an internationally known teacher on faith, worldviews, and storytelling through worldviews. He's an Amazon best-selling author. He's a prolific author. You're going to get to see his Amazon page here. You should have at least 6 months or more worth of reading in just his Amazon page alone. He's a writer of biblical fiction. His series that I have enjoyed so much was the Chronicles of the Nephilim. Really good stuff there. And a provo theology called a God Against All the Gods. And he's obsessed with our Father in heaven, just like many of you are. If you're on this channel, I'm guessing that's the reason why. Movies, worldviews, results, and theological storytelling that blows your mind. I can attest to that. It does get you going while inspiring your soul. And as he says here, he's not exaggerating. That is the truth. He is not exaggerating. Very, very talented writer and a gifted storyteller. Brian, welcome to Disputed Lands. Thanks for being here, brother.
Thanks for having me on, Chad. I appreciate it.
Well, Brian, as I told you beforehand, I wanted to give you an opportunity, if you want to give Josh and Christina a word of encouragement. Now's your chance, brother.
Absolutely. Josh, Christina, and Nathan praying for you. Josh, I want to thank you for just being really, I mean, I'm not just kissing up. You're probably one of the best interviewers that I've ever had because with one of the best interviews I've ever had. Like, what was it, 3.5, 4 hours on eschatology, where you and I have opposite views, but you were the most pleasant, helpful, interesting, interviewer, and we had a great talk, a great discussion, and I thank you for that. Thank you for being a friend of mine on the opposite side of the aisle, which is not usual. And but Nathan, just praying for you, man, and just praying that God will power you up. This one's for you, bud.
Amen. Thanks, Brian, for that. Brian, tonight we're going to talk to you about a new series, and I'm excited for this. I enjoyed your Nephilim Chronicles so much that when you talk of a new series that you're coming out with, we're actually going to talk about two different things. That you're a very busy guy. You don't stay idle. We're going to talk about two different topics, but the first one we're going to talk about is Jezebel. This character Jezebel we find in the Bible. You have a point here of talking about spiritual stories of Canaan's gods, Baal, Asherah, Astarte, and Anat. I'm not sure if I've pronounced those correctly, but tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chronicles of the Watchers, Jezebel is the first in the series, Chronicles of the Watchers. And as you mentioned, my prior series, the best-selling one, Chronicles of the Nephilim, the Watchers series is sort of a sequel in a way. It's certainly what it ends up being is a continuation of stories that you could actually integrate. If you're reading Chronicles of the Nephilim, you can, if you want to read them chronologically, you could slip in Watcher novels in between if you want to read it chronologically. But every novel still basically can be read alone if you want. And particularly the first one in this series was very exciting for me to write. The premise of it is with the Watchers, as I'm sure your audience knows, that the Watchers is a term that refers to these territorial spirits in the Bible that are spoken of when God talks about in, say, for instance, Deuteronomy 32, where he says how, the nations are actually, the Gentile nations are actually allotted to these sons of God or these watchers over nations, just like Israel was allotted to him or allotted to Jesus. And so, this picture you know, uh, that is drawn throughout the Bible is of, let's put it this way, it's of a world gone evil. And God basically says, okay, you're not, he destroys the earth the first time with the flood, right? And he does that in response to these watchers, these sons of God coming to earth, mating with daughters of men, producing these Nephilim, weird, bizarre things, right? And of course, that leads to great evil and violence of humanity on the earth. And so everything's corrupted in that sense. So along comes Noah, he does the flood. But then after the flood, God starts over, and lo and behold, mankind does it again, and they build the Tower of Babel, wanting to, the tower that reaches to the heavens, and that's more of a spiritual concept than a literal one. But the idea is that was the connection to the gods and a kind of a deification of all humanity as one. And of course, God's he confuses the tongues and spreads them out on the nation. He creates the nations with different tongues, keep that from occurring, because if man united, the evil would be so great. So that, and but then what he does is in Deuteronomy we read about how when God does that, he then allots all these different nations to be under the authorities of territorial spirits. It's like saying, okay, look, if you're going to worship these false gods, I'm going to give you over to them, like Romans 1 says. I'm going to give you over to those gods, and you're going to be under their authority and see how you like it. It's that kind of concept, right? But he keeps Israel as his own. So, and there are other passages that indicate Michael, the archangel, is probably the prince over Israel. We read about that in Daniel. And so you've got these this concept that in the Bible and also in the ancient Near Eastern religions, all of them pretty much believe this, and that is that when you have earthly um, uh, wars and dramatic things and instances, it also is connected to the heavenly world. And so there are heavenly counterparts that are going on. So, they basically believe that, the authorities in the heavens were directly connected to the earthly authorities. So, for instance, when a king would be judged, or let's say a nation would be at war, and one nation would destroy another, they would believe that in the heavenlies a battle was going on at the same time with the heavenly authorities in the same way that the earthly authorities were. So that if there was a fall of a nation like Babylon, you would get this notion of also the watchers or the territorial spirits would also fall with them. And that's what you get in Daniel when Daniel talks about how the prince of Persia fighting with the prince of Greece and all this kind of stuff, right? So that's sort of the big picture watcher paradigm. And I wanted to retell biblical stories where that watcher paradigm could come up and could apply. And eventually, I want to expand out to the other nations and tell the other mythological stories of other nations and how they might be related. What I do is I use fiction as a way of sort of pulling back the veil of the supernatural world and what might it look like. We don't know exactly what it looks like, but I try to paint the picture of what these spiritual territorial authorities might be, what might be going on while things in earth are going on, right? So in the novel Jezebel, so basically each of these books tends to have this two-part story going on: the human story, which will be
Hmm.
things like Jezebel and Elijah and all that stuff, and then also I try to tell a story what might have been going on in the spiritual realm. Now, the other sort of premise of the series, which is it's kind of a little speculative, but I think it's theologically sensible, but it is speculative, and that is my premise for Chronicles of the Nephilim and Chronicles of the Watchers was, we all know about all these gods of the ancient world, right? And
Hmm.
always
The
had
Michael Heiser Unseen Realm. My audience is very familiar with that.
exactly.
So.
And and if you look at history, they tend to be looked upon as being mere constructs. So, they're myths, they're stories, they're,
Mhm.
whatever, false gods that don't really exist, right?
Right.
But if you read the Bible, there are lots of indications and hints that there is actually a demonic reality behind those false gods. Now, excuse me, does that mean that all the gods are literally, each of the gods from every nations are literally some demonic entity? I don't know. But the concept there is that there is a demonic reality. So what I said was, well, what if the gods of the ancient world, like if we look at Canaan, the gods of Canaan, Baal, the storm god, right? Asherah, the wife of El, the mighty god, uh, Ashtart, and even these gods and goddesses that appear in the Bible. I said, well, what if those gods were actually real, but they weren't gods in the sense that most people might think of them, but they were these watchers that God placed over the nations. They watchers were divine beings, but then they wanted to draw worship away from Yahweh, and so they cultivated these religions of worship, and they sort of masqueraded as deities to be worshipped. That kind of a thing. So in my novel stories, and I do this in Jezebel as well, I have the story going on of these gods behind the scenes, and they're sort of wrestling battles with the archangels. Like you've got Baal, the storm god, shows up in Jezebel, and because he's the sort of the high god of Canaan, and he
Hmm.
also happens to be the god that is connected to Jezebel. She's the one that brings Baal worship into Israel. Um, Now, Baal worship had been going on already down in the south in Judah, but there's ups and downs in terms of the idolatry of Israel and Judah, right? But
Hmm.
he brings Baal worship and builds a temple of Baal, and this is a very critical turning point in history because um, never before had a actual temple of Baal been built like that and had such a stranglehold. And of course Jezebel has the heritage of being the probably the most wicked, ruthless queen in all of the Bible. Um, and she's wicked for bringing that. And what's interesting is that I wanted to I wanted to depict these gods, and they're battling with Michael and Raphael and Gabriel and the other archangels. And I use this sort of traditional understanding of the seven archangels. I don't know how many there really are, but so I use those characters in these stories. And what I do is I'm telling the Bible story at the same time that I'm also trying to tell the stories of the Canaanite gods, and I integrate the mythology into the story to
Mm.
sort of show the spiritual connection of it all. Now, if that, I don't know if that's confusing or not, but
No,
that,
no,
that's the premise of what I'm trying to do.
yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And for those of you who have not read Brian's series before, I don't know if you've done it in this series. I'm just going to assume you did. He does something that no other, pretty much no other past fictional writers of Christian material have done. He provides you scriptural references and material and stuff, so you can go back and check the actual facts that his stories are based upon, the scriptures, the references, the papers, or whatever. It's very much what you would expect from a regular thesis in that regard, only done with the fictional story, where he gives you and paints a picture of what it might have looked like. And, folks, I want you to understand or appreciate the kind of effort this takes. Look, there are a lot of writers who write fictional stories. They get to completely make up the story, the facts, the location, the places, the history, and they get to have all kinds of fun just doing what they want to do within the story. Sure, good writers, they can intrigue you. You have folks like Sharon Gilbert, who will write a fictional series that's based on true factual history, much like how much more difficult the task is for Brian. And he, off the air, he called himself Brian the Heretic, but because he is provocative in that he has the difficult task of giving you biblical history and then painting a picture of what might it have looked. Look, Brian in no means is saying this is exactly the way it happened, this is the words they said, or anything, which is what
scripture.
We're not writing scripture, which is, I'm sure, what he is referencing when people want to use these connotations. They miss the whole point. They really miss the whole point of what Brian is doing.
Yeah.
And I want you to know, Brian, that I appreciate the difficulty in how hard it is, let alone to write, but to write in the manner that you're doing. You've really taken on a load, what many authors who would ever set out, and what they would consider an unnecessarily load or risk in doing what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll be honest, I'm actually surprised at how many other Christians also do get it. When I first started this series 8 or 9 years ago with Noah Primeval, that was the first one. And I got to tell you, my journey began with discovering Michael Heiser's work. This was long before he was famous, and he was writing his book that would ultimately become The Unseen Realm, and he had it available for free for PDF online, because he was this obscure theologian who wants to, he didn't think he didn't understand how big it would become. So I nabbed that when he was still working on it and stuff, and it blew my mind. And I suddenly saw, oh my gosh, there's this picture, there's this storyline going throughout the Bible that I had not seen before. And it doesn't go against the Bible, it supports the scripture. And I come from a conservative Christian, Orthodox understanding, little o, of the Bible. So I'm not some liberal heretic or anything like that.
Right.
But what happened was, this was just beginning to sort of crest, and some scholars had known about this. But so, like you said, now it's much more well known, and that. But like 9 years ago, it wasn't. And so when I first started writing that book, I thought, oh man, because I come from an evangelical background. So evangelicals are like, you don't toy with the Bible type of thing. And I even had that in my own heart. I did, because I respect the Word of God. I don't want to fiddle with it, right? But there's something that ancient Jews did, and that's called midrash, where they would retell and Bible stories to try to apply them to their world at the time, or whatever. And a lot of these are apocryphal or pseudepigraphal books that we know about, Jubilees, some of these other books. And what I realized was that that's what I wanted to do. Is I just wanted to retell those stories in a way that the modern world can appreciate and be entertained by, but learn theological truths from it. So, I push the envelope. I have some creative, things that I do there. But my main goal was I wanted to depict the supernatural world in a way that would be, interesting and literary. So, for instance, what I did was I, there's Leviathan is a common creature in the Bible. And, some Christians think it's a dinosaur, just a sea monster, whatever. But if you do a
Hmm.
study of Leviathan, you actually find that it's actually a poetic or mythological concept that embodies chaos, the dragon of chaos, sea dragon in particular of chaos. And, the Bible uses it, biblical writers use it as a metaphor or as an image to describe a theological truth, namely, for example, that the God of Israel is bringing his covenanted order into the chaos of the desert that is Canaan, right? And so even when it describes in, Psalm 78, where it's describing them going through the Red Sea, and it says God crushes the heads of Leviathan, he's saying that the sea represents the chaos that God is holding back. And this is not to say that that was a mythological event. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that it's describing the historical event, but it's also using these metaphors and images to communicate theological truths, namely that when God was establishing his covenanted people, right after that was Sinai, right? When he is establishing his covenanted people, he's pushing back the chaos and he's bringing order. And so this is the kind of thing that goes on. So I would depict Leviathan in my novel series. There is a real creature, Leviathan, who's a sea dragon of chaos, and he shows up a lot, And but my worry was that Christians would say, oh, you're playing with the word of God and you're changing the word of God, you're cursed and all this. But you know what? I just in my heart, I just knew that this was a truthful way of going about it, using imagination. And I'm not claiming to write scripture. These are theological novels. I'm not saying this is literally how it is or whatever. And so I did it, and it really was a real freeing experience for me. But I was surprised to discover that Christians really embraced it. I've had very little resistance or hate mail, all that kind of stuff. But because I was worried, I thought, okay. And I'm kind of like this myself because I come from an evangelical background. I like to know what's the biblical basis of what you're saying. I always have that behind my heart, thinking, even if I read something
Sure.
fiction, So I thought, well,
Sure.
why don't I do what Michael Crichton did? Michael Crichton would always write an appendix at the end of his book that was explaining a little bit of the real science that his fiction was based on. I said, well, why don't I do that with the biblical theology of behind the stories that I'm telling,
Right.
And I kind of did it. I actually did it a little for myself because I like theology too. I don't like just fiction and stuff, But I was worried because I thought people might not like it. But I did it, and it turned out to be one of the best things I could do because a lot of Christians have said they appreciate the appendixes as much as the novels at times because they like to have things explained in a way that makes sense and go, okay, I can appreciate that,
Well,
And that's what happened.
I can tell you from my point of view, I used growing up, and maybe this is true for most people. I don't know. We're all brought up, but I spent a vast majority of my time outside of the scriptures reading fictional material as entertainment.
Yeah.
And, that was a way to relax. And that changed over time to where now a majority of what I read is factual or theological thesis type information, documentation, that kind of thing, reality, history, a far more amount of my time in that kind of reading material personally. It is nice. It is nice because that is also my pleasure. I enjoy doing it, but everybody knows everybody has a wall where you can only read so much, right? You can only read so much of that where it's like, you know what, I've got to decompress, I've got to process, I've got to think about, digest, whatever term you want to use, insert in that blank there. You have to put it aside. But I don't want to put aside what I enjoy while I'm doing that. The brain needs a break, but I don't want to be just filling it with garbage out there, right? I still enjoy reading. It's nice to have authors like yourself, like a Sharon Gilbert, where I can pick up the book, be entertained, and yet I'm not going to be filled with garbage, fluff, and stuff that's going to, detract or take away from my thought process, or add, just junk in that just is unnecessary, doesn't need to be there, worldly stuff. I can be entertained and not leave the path. I don't know if there's a better way to say it, but
No, yeah, absolutely. But there's another aspect too that I think, guys like you and me, we can, read the heavy theology stuff all day long probably, but not a lot of people can, it's just personality types, the way God makes us. So
sure,
one's not good or bad. Some people more left brain, some people more right brain. And I feel
right.
that God sort of, cursed me and blessed me with a both right and left brain personality. I love both the intellect and the creative, and so I kind of combine those things together. And so for those people who can't get into the heavy theology stuff, they can. I My goal is for them to read my books and to ingest the theology through the storytelling, through the narrative. So you actually will learn quite a bit of biblical truths through the storytelling, which is really what the Bible does anyway, right? And so
Hmm.
that's sort of my premise as well. It's like the both and, right? And that's what I
Right.
love about it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So a little bit of a side note there, but people who are watch my show know that I'm a conversationalist, and Brian and I haven't been able to converse any prior to the show. I'm just getting to know Brian. So how are you going to get to know somebody if you don't talk with them and have a conversation? So I'm kind of taking liberties, get to do that with it being the show. So, but without going too much further and getting sidetracked, we're going to go back to this story of Jezebel.
Yes.
You had left off where
There's a
you
lot of
talked
great
about
stuff.
the Israelite acceptance of a pagan idol worship as normal that Jezebel had introduced. So that also included something else that I think maybe people weren't aware of, but is factual documented history. And that's Israelites believed Yahweh had a wife. Uh, Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that one of the aspects of my personal journey is that I like I said, I come from a more traditional evangelical background. I tend to be more conservative, but I'm not afraid to interact with liberals. And the truth is that honestly, if you read both sides of things, you'll find that both sides have biases. Both sides are, yeah, they both have biases, so they're both blind to things. And so when I started to realize that, you know what, the evangelical side or my side of things, I tend to believe, but I can see them sort of dismissing things or ignoring things that they don't want to deal with that would challenge their understanding. And so I've read the other side and I see them doing the same thing, but they also have challenged me to see things that I was trying not to see. And this Asherah as a wife is one of them. But it's a great example of how I think we can deal with these things, be open-minded and not be pig-headed, but yet also retain our tradition and our understanding. So, for example, the liberals will come out and say, well, look, we found these archaeological figures, and this is a fact, all throughout Israel, thousands of them, little figurines of Asherah. And there's also some inscriptions at a couple different sites where it talks about how Yahweh has a wife, Asherah. And of course, what the liberal scholars say, well, first of all, the conservative scholars like either brush over it, ignore it, or dismiss it, right? They don't deal with it. But I'm like, this is real stuff. You can't deny archaeology. You've got to understand it and incorporate it somehow into your understanding and maybe change your way of seeing things if you have to. Maybe you're not right about everything, right? So, but when you look into it and you realize, well, look, the liberals come at it by saying, well, we don't believe the Bible's true. So anything they can come up with to sort of discredit the Bible. And what better way but to say, oh, look, see, uh, the Bible's wrong when it talks about believing in one God. They actually were believing God had a wife. And so then they concoct this whole evolutionary theory to say that that was the real religion of Israel. That's
Hmm.
all they really did. And then after a period, after the exile, and when they come back from Babylon way later, then they make up all these stories and retell their past to make them look
Right.
all this. So that's the literal. But the truth is that there's always some truth in every side. And what it did was it forced me to go back and study these passages. And here's where I had, and maybe some of your audience has this experience too. Maybe you hadn't. Maybe you're smarter than me. But I was sort of raised with this mentality of, you okay, I read the Old Testament, and yeah, it talks about Israel falling away and worshiping the gods and coming back to Yahweh and falling away. So it's like, okay, well, I get that, but my understanding of that was sort of like the modern day Christian experience of, say, like a Christian who's an alcoholic, or addicted to porn or something like that, and we seek God, and the alcoholic may fall off the wagon, right? Get drunk and then
Hmm.
repent and come back to God, that kind of thing. And that's how I saw the idolatry. But I
Yeah, just
came
not going to church.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And by the way, I think that's a universal struggle. Everybody has sins that haunt them, and we seek to struggle with them. But the thing is, that's not really the picture that that is actually in the Bible. And when
Hmm.
you look at it more closely, you discover, and this goes throughout the book of First and Second Kings in particular. It's Judges as well, but Kings is where the Jezebel story comes from. And you look at the kings, and it lists them, and it describes what they did, and oh my goodness, what you discover is, as a matter of fact, it wasn't the picture that I see now is not that the Jews were a monotheistic culture who lapsed into polytheism. They were actually more of a polytheistic culture who lapsed occasionally into monotheism, meaning that God, but it's not that God was the construct and polytheism was the original thing. What it was they kept falling away from Yahweh, but their falling was deep and real. It wasn't shallow. And so, for instance, you find, if you add up the years of the kings and stuff, and you find out where it talks about when they worshipped Asherah and when they didn't, for about the 300 and I don't know 360 years or whatever that the Temple of Solomon existed. 2/3 of that time, which is roughly 200 and some odd 230 years or something like that, they worshipped Asherah. And we're taught, and it's not just that the rural people did because they were far away from the city or far away from Jerusalem, so they were more ignorant. Yes, that's true, but it's also true in the major cities, including Jerusalem, because you find out there was a Asherah pole in the holy temple of Israel for most of that existence, as well as Nehushtan, the bronze serpent that was worshipped as an idol in the
Right.
holy temple. So what I'm getting at is, I'm not saying like the liberal that, oh, therefore that means that was accepted as normal. No, it was sinful, and God, that's why God sent the prophets, because what I came to realize is really the prophets are about the only pure people in all of Israel. Everyone was so corrupted. God was trying to call them back. He had to send individual men, because even the priesthood was worshiping Asherah, worshiping Baal, worshiping Molech. This isn't just a one time, or they would fall away and do it and come back. They would do this for hundreds of years sometimes, or at least dozens of years. And then a good king would come, try to get rid of it, but he would die, and a bad king would rise, and it would bring it all back. So my point here is that it just shows how truly depraved we are as human beings, but in particular Israel, that God needed the prophets, which really elevates their sort of their ministry, I think, in the text. Um, and so it also explains the archaeological artifacts. This is why normal Israelites would actually be worshiping Yahweh. This wasn't a either or thing for them. It was like, yeah, we worship Yahweh, but we also worship Asherah as his wife, because, and as well as Baal, the storm god, because they would. It's sort of like, well, hey, might as well have a few extra gods to help us along, if we need the help with our crops or what have
Mm.
you. And so that was one sort of paradigm changing understanding for me that helped me to understand what's going on in this time period. So therefore, when I tell my story, Jezebel, you're going to read an Israel that, maybe you haven't read before, maybe you haven't seen it before in other texts where they're going, my Israel in the story of Jezebel are basically idol worshippers throughout the whole story. There are the prophets, there's Elijah, there's the Rechabites, so what I try to do is I try to depict what would be the daily life in Israel going on at this time period, and I describe how the women would, get their stuff together, and they would each have a shrine room in each of their houses where they would have shrine to Asherah, as well as to Yahweh, and also to Bes, the little dwarf god, to help them with their fertility. Because don't forget, fertility was the key to the growth of the nation, and yet, it was a very the Bronze Age and the Iron Age was a very brutal time period, so people didn't live long, and they lost a lot of babies. So they were desperate to keep fertility going, so they reached out to these fertility goddesses. And it was, wow, what a fascinating world that was, of this mixture, the syncretism that God did not like. And into that mixture, of course, comes Elijah, and that's where I try to bring that picture. But there's another side of that story that I also try to cover, which is I also used to, and like I always had this picture of Elijah, right, as being like, I mean, look, here you have this guy who, he calls fire down from heaven. Like, who would have the guts to say, okay, well, we'll both put up a sacrifice, and the God who answers with fire from heaven, he's the God, and the God who and the ones who don't, you you kill all their prophets, right? I mean, this guy, saw the whirlwind. He saw these amazing epiphanies of Yahweh, right? And I always thought like he was one of those like really holy guys that I couldn't relate to, because I could try to learn from the people who stumbled in life, but surely someone like Elijah would be hard to relate to because he was so holy and removed. But when I studied closely, I found no, no. As a matter of fact, Elijah was probably the most like us than anybody else. You could relate to him because here you have a man, and I deal with all this as I tell the story of Elijah and Jezebel. I'm going through Elijah's own struggle and how here he calls down fire from heaven on the mountain, right? He wins. King Ahab takes him in. Come on, you're doing great. So he's on the up, and literally the next day he gets a letter, not even in person, just a letter from Jezebel who says, I'm going to do to you what you did to the prophets, right? And what does he do? He runs away. He
Right.
runs in fear. I'm thinking, how could you run in fear if you just called down fire from heaven and killed 400 prophets of Baal, right? And that just, okay, I see myself in that. And it also tells me he wasn't this great, powerful, faithful man. He struggled with faith just as much as we all do, even though he saw greater works than we get to see, right? And so, but the other side of the story is he didn't just, and this is what I learned is like, okay, he didn't just run away from Jezebel. I can relate to when I'm fearful and I run away um, from standing up for my faith or something like that. I understand that fearfulness that we all struggle with, and but he didn't just run away from it. He ran to where? He ran to Mount Horeb, which is the mountain of God. He ran to Yahweh. And so we draw from that same principle. We can draw from him because he was as weak as any one of us. And
Mm.
yeah, so that's one of those are some of the elements that I try so in other words, I'm not just telling the story with all the fantastic things that are happening and all the gods fighting with the angels. I'm trying to connect with the human characters in the story that we can relate to spiritually. And boy, Elijah it surprised me how much I can really relate to him, but also the bad guys like Jezebel and Ahab as well.
This is just really one aspect of your writing, and this really speaks to, I think, Brian, your gift as a writer, is that this isn't the only kind of storytelling you do. You have another kind of storytelling that you're doing that's just really kind of unique. Not many have really, again, tried to reach out into this area of it. They tend to separate one style of writing with this purpose and this style of writing for that purpose. And you just kind of tear down those rules a little bit. You reach into territory that's little traveled, and you have, and I'm going to go ahead and share the screen at this time, my screen. You can find this on Amazon. What you want to do is you can just look for Brian, type his name, or you can go to Godawa.com. It's probably the quickest way, but you can go to Amazon and you have here what you call Screenplays as Literature series. And you have a 12-book series that's out. So you can scroll down. They're all available right there. So for those who are not familiar with this, huh?
Yeah, I was just saying, yeah, let me tell you about that.
Tell me about this. Tell us about this. What's going on here?
This is a new form of storytelling that I'm trying to break through with and open up the public to discover. Of course, it's always been there. And, there are screenplays you can get online like The Matrix or, Silence of the Lambs, big hit movies. And people might tend to like to read the screenplays, but it's usually an oddity. It's not a normal form of reading. Most people aren't familiar with it because they think, well, I watch movies. Why would I want to read the script? Doesn't make sense. But here's the thing. I'm a screenwriter, so I've been doing this for many years. And as a screenwriter, you write a lot of screenplays that don't get made into movies, and I started realizing, these are such great stories. And I read a lot of screenplays and I'm thinking, why don't I publish them? Because they're just sitting on my shelf and there's so much of who I am and what I want to, the kind of stories I want to tell in the world. And of course, the reason why I held back was because most people don't read screenplays. But I started thinking, I want to educate the public and realize that you can read screenplays and actually it's a form of storytelling that you might actually really enjoy. And here's why. They're different, right? Different forms. Like some people like reading novels. Some people like reading huge, long novels, right? Some people like reading shorter ones. A lot of people love short stories. Some people tell me, oh, well, I like a short story because I could just sit down and read the whole story in a 20-minute sitting and go to sleep and enjoy it or whatever. But some people love the long, long novels. Well, a screenplay is right in between. It's longer than a short story, shorter than a novel, but it's written ultimately with the end in mind to become a movie. So it's got its own unique format, but it's not really hard to read. And in every one of my books, I just give you a couple pages. Okay, here are some things to be familiar with, and you'll catch on really quick. People sometimes are afraid, and it's like, don't worry about it. You catch on quick. And all my fans have caught on, and they're like, oh yeah, it's really easy. But the thing is it tends to stress dialogue. It tends to be sort of more economical language because in a screenplay, see, in a novel, you're reading a novel and you'll expect to hear descriptions of the scene. Like if I'm in a room, they're going to describe the kind of painting it is or whatever, the kind of home it is, a Victorian home with these kinds of bricks or whatever. And of course, different levels of detail, but you tend to have to describe the world that you're in a novel in detail, and people like that. But some people like me, I get bored with some of that. And a screenplay is great because it'll every scene you're in, it'll paint a real quick paintbrush. A few sentences. It doesn't go into. It'll just say, he's in an old Victorian house, so you get this feel, and then you imagine yourself what that might look like, and then it gets into the action and into the dialogue. And so this is a form of storytelling that is a lot more abbreviated. But here's the thing. As a screenwriter, I can tell you that we have to put a lot of work. When you're doing something shorter, it actually has to be tighter, and it takes a little more time than writing something long because you have to know how to condense, simplify, and pick only the best elements of the story. So you'll be surprised that, and in all my screenplays, there's a lot of depth to them. It's just through a lot. So almost like every word is super important, and you draw something from every word, from every piece of dialogue. They're full and rich with meaning, and it forces you to communicate more in fewer words. And that's sort of the premise of it, right? And of course, my bottom line is if you love movies, then you got to at least try reading some screenplays, because when you read the screenplay, it's like you're imagining the movie in your mind. You can see it in your mind's eye. So I tell people my tagline is read the script, imagine the movie. And that's what happens to me as a screenwriter when I'm reading other scripts. And so I thought, I think people might love doing this. And I think it's something that might catch on, and I'm hoping that it will. Therefore, what I did was I started publishing scripts that I've written on throughout the years. And like you already mentioned, Screenplays is literature. I just wanted to focus on one script right now. We can talk about
Yeah.
other ones, but
Yeah, I'm going to
down
scroll
there,
down to that one right now.
scroll down to Descent of the Gods. And the reason why I'm picking this one is because I think it'll be very, uh, there's all kinds of genres that I cover. I have action, I have detective, I have comedy, I have historical epics. If you and all of my stories have a Christian worldview. But this one in particular might be interesting to this audience because it's a horror movie and it's about alien abductions. But Michael Heiser was actually a consultant for me on the story, because the story is basically this. There's a reality TV show crew that sets out to debunk alien abductions, right? And they go out to this remote cabin out in the Texas uh, area there, near the Rio Grande, I think. And they go to
Sorry, the link
the link is
auto.
wrong.
No, it was behind. I think I accidentally clicked it
Oh,
twice.
oh, okay. Because I was gonna say
Sorry. I was just
sometimes
explaining what people were seeing on the screen. Why it's
Amazon has bad clicks. So
yeah.
so anyway, so it's this reality show that goes to debunk it, right? They're making fun of it, but then what starts to happen is weird UFO things start to occur, and they discover at the cabin there's this strange, and what's big nowadays is ancient aliens, right? So they bring a scholar with them who knows all about the ancient world, because they want to talk about this ancient aliens connection, right? But at the cabin they discover there's a strange sort of stone and then a pole next to it, and then there's like they find it underneath the cabin. There's in the foundation stone, there's an engraving that looks like it's ancient Phoenician or Canaanite, and it has the god Baal on it, and they're like, what is this? And so I start to incorporate, there's some connections going on with the Phoenicians and with Baal and Anat, his his violent killing sister. And so I'll leave it at that. I won't give all the plot away, but you can start to see where this might go with these people as they think they're debunking something and they stumble onto something far bigger than they realized and far darker than they realized. And of course, so it's a horror movie, so it's got all the scares in there, and it is actually scary. So if you're really sensitive, you may not want to. You may want to be careful. Maybe read one of the other scripts first, because it's a pretty scary one, right? And
Right.
so anyway, that's sort of uh, the sort of premise of Descent of the Gods. But if you're a fan of my work, you can also get Noah Primeval, the movie, which is basically the movie version of my Noah Primeval novel. And just to real briefly let you know what that was actually the entire series of my writing. The first novel was Noah Primeval, but it was first a script. Because see, what
Mm.
happened was about 9-10 years ago was when I actually started discovering the Heiser stuff, and I thought, oh man, this would make a Hollywood movie, because even though Hollywood doesn't like Christianity, they love this kind of supernatural stuff, right? And
Sure they do.
if I have giants and watchers, oh my gosh, no one's ever done this before. And I wrote the script and I started shopping around town, and I'm not a big guy, so I don't have big connections. And then I discovered Darren Aronofsky was making his Noah movie. And I thought, oh, he's going to beat me to the punch. So I decided, well, how can I get it out so that I won't look derivative? And I realized I got to novelize it. And so that's sort of was the impetus for me to novelize it. But then when I wrote the novel, and I did more research, and I realized, oh, this is way bigger than Noah. I thought I could get 4 novels out of this and go through the Bible. And of
Right.
course, now I'm like 12 novels later, right?
Right.
And it's
Creative
still
juices
going.
just got flowing.
Yeah. So it's a storyline, and it's all connected. At least in the spiritual realm, it's all connected through a thread. So, anyway, so again, it'll be a shorter movie version. So it's, as most people know, movies are not like the books. Oftentimes they have to be shorter. You got to cut a lot out, so it's a sort of a different take on the same story, if that makes sense. And so people can get Noah Primeval the movie if they want as well. And there's plenty of others that are on there that you can look, depending on what genres you may like. But all of the scripts come from have a Christian worldview to them, as I do, but they're not going to be biblical stories,
Per se.
yeah, per se. They're more like for real movies, because I really wanted to make them into Hollywood type movies. So you expect that from them. So, rated PG-13, some of them and stuff. But and I love history, so quite a few of them are historical, and some of them are actually have been made into movies, like the movie Alleged, which is about the Scopes monkey trial. That script is really good. I tell you the story that Inherit the Wind did not tell you. If you remember this, Inherit the Wind is where everybody gets their ideas of the Scopes monkey trial, which is a complete lie. And I tell more of a truer story, but I also use fiction. And there's other stuff as well. Oh, I wanted to say, this month I will be. Well, I don't know when you're going to be having the
Well, this
recording.
is actually airing probably in April
Okay.
when people will see it.
So by the time you see this, I will have a new script available, To End All Wars, which was my first movie that was made many years ago. And the script, you will now be able to get the script to End All Wars in the same series, for those of you who are
Oh, wow.
fans of the movie. I
That's
still have people contacting me saying it's still one of my favorite movies of all time. So yeah, it's a fan love. It's a fan based movie for sure still.
Well, that's excellent. Well, Brian, we actually covered our time here pretty good, and we were able to talk about pretty much both the topics that you
Great.
thought would be interesting to address tonight. So, praise God that worked out well. This interview has just gone so smoothly. And if, like I said to my audience, I've read, I've listened. Brian's been on VFTB with Derek and Sharon Gilbert. He's been on Revolutionary Radio with Rob Skiba, as well as many other programs and shows. You need to go to his website, which has been scrolling across your screen here on a whole time. He has a plethora of materials and information, books, screenplays, writing short stories, long stories. Every genre, this guy is just his gifting. He loves to write, and he does a great job at telling a story. As we've said in different ways, perhaps that's the best way you soak up information.
Amen.
And it's, and there are a lot of people who are like this. Then please visit his site, check out his books, check out this new style of writing. You may just find that there's something that you enjoyed about reading that you never knew before. When it comes to the screen, I've read a couple of screenplays myself, and it's hard really to describe. Like you said, when you're talking about when you're reading a story, the author really does have to take the time to describe for you what the characters are seeing, feeling, smelling, what it looks like. They really paint the picture for you. Yeah, of course, your imagination, fills in the gaps of what that looks like.
But it's much more detailed.
But it's much more detailed. With screenwriting, they tell you what's there, and then you have to take the time to develop that for yourself. Okay, what does this look like in the mind's eye, right?
Yeah, and
you
it's
really have to kind of construct it for yourself of what
yes,
it would look like.
but it's also a faster paced storytelling. You could read
Absolutely.
a screenplay within a couple hours. And
Right.
so for those of you who really want to get a power packed story, like you've watched a movie, but you've been reading a book, screenplays are perfect.
That's awesome.
Absolutely.
Great way to say it. Well, folks, as I said, the whole purpose behind these interviews and this marathon, we were raising money for Josh and Christina Peck. Go to thedailyrenegade.com, find the donate button, and go there. If you've been with us by now, I'm not sure exactly what order these are going to be in, but they're pretty close. But we've had interviews with Dr. Heiser. We've had interviews with folks like Jim Barfield, or he may be coming up yet. I don't know, depending on where the series. That interview has already taken place, so I can tell you it's going to be there with the Copper Scroll Project. Shelley Neese, Mike Spalding, Dr. Lake will be on, and many others, Mark Flynn. Stick around. There's going to be more interviews yet to come after this one for sure. I really appreciate you guys joining us for this. And Brian, it's been my pleasure and my joy getting to know you and actually talk to you face to face after hearing you and reading your materials for so long. It's one of those check marks I get a note off my personal bucket list here that I've gotten to meet Brian Godawa, and not everybody gets to say that they do these kind of things. So I feel very fortunate to have made your acquaintance, Brian. Thank you so much for being on. We'll have you on again, I'm sure, in the future. If schedules work out and we can meet and you're going to be available, we'll definitely have. I'm sure I'll be reading more of your stuff, so I'm sure there'll be something else I'm intrigued in that I want to bring you on and talk about now that we've come to know each other. Folks, you have been watching Disputed Lands. This is Take on the World TV. Thanks again for joining us. Don't go away. There will be another interview right after this one, and see you there.
Get right, get inside, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey. Get right, get inside, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey. Get right, get inside, get hungry, word of God appetite.